Welcome to DW's web talk, Lobbyists in the EU, the Puppet Masters, How Lobbyists Influence the EU Legislation Process. I'm Kate Musa. How much of a say do lobbyists have when it comes to making laws in Brussels? And what do Brussels' estimated 15,000 lobbyists actually do every day? And can the consumer benefit from lobby groups? That's what we'll be discussing on today's DW web talk. Joining me today in cyberspace are three special guests. We have Hans-Peter Martin, who's an independent MEP from Austria. Hans-Peter, welcome. Where are you calling in from today?
Well, right now I'm just in Tübingen, which is somewhere close to Strasbourg. And I've been over the week in Brussels, and I say hello to everybody who is watching and will be watching.
Welcome. Our next guest, Peter van der Mark, is the Secretary General of the European Smoking Tobacco Association. Peter, where are you seated right now?
I'm seated in Brussels in my office, Ron von Schumann, looking at the various buildings of the EU.
Thank you. Welcome, Peter. And Pascoe Sabido is from the lobby watchdog Corporate Europe Observatory. Pascoe, are you also joining us from Brussels today?
Our offices are in Brussels, but in fact today I'm in London. I've come home for a short visit, so I'll be broadcasting from London.
Great to have you here. Well, we've got a number of different European cities represented with us today, so let's get started. Now, Peter, we'll start with you. Many people may think that a lobbyist spends a lot of his time going to cocktail parties, spending dinners and lunches with the MEPs. Is that what your everyday life really looks like?
No, not really. I think everybody who works in interest representation or working as a lobbyist knows that 80% of your time is actually spent on doing your homework. Is understanding what legislative proposals are being developed, how the impact of those proposals are on the interest you are representing, the industry or consumers, whoever you are representing, and then formulating an opinion and looking for facts and figures to support your opinions.
So research doesn't sound quite as sexy as cocktail parties, but
no.
Now you represent an industry that's highly regulated when it comes to lobbyism. So how is it that you get by these regulations to really have an influence on the people that you're trying to influence, the MEPs?
Well, we don't talk really about influencing because it is always used to actually paint a rather dark or negative picture. What all lobbyists actually in Brussels do is actually represent the interest of their target group. In my instance, that's the tobacco industry, in particular a group of 50 companies, many of which are small and medium-sized in their size. So our job mainly is focused on making sure that we can actually share our expertise, answer questions, if there are any, from the various institutions with regards to our topics, which of course is tobacco legislation. Mm-hmm. There are rules in place, mandatory rules, as well as rules in place which we sign up ourselves. There are voluntary code of conduct which you can bind yourself to.
Now you say that having influence has a bad rap. Hans-Peter, for 2 whole years you kept a log of all of the invitations and the offers that you received from various lobbyists and lobby groups. Why exactly did you do that, and what was the result?
Because I think what we just heard is not really representing what's going on in Brussels. In fact, as an MEP that I am, a member on the Economic Committee, I get 2 or 3 invitations per day for really nice dinners, breakfasts, travels abroad to China. We're, for example, talking about the tobacco industry. The fact has been that every single MEP got a valuable bottle of wine the very moment when we were talking about labeling, and there was a very, very strong influence and even pressure put on each one of us that we would vote accordingly, and there have been in the background pressure saying, well, if you are getting into too much regulation, we will make you a difficult life during your election campaign.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it works? What kind of impact does it have on you when you get a really nice bottle of wine and maybe enjoy it at home with your wife? Does that actually have an influence on the decisions you make?
Not me. I've been a reporter with Der Spiegel for 15 years. I have earned very good money with writing books. But what is happening is just a permanent embracing of the individual MEP, and you get closer and closer with the lobbyist if you don't really say, hey, there has to be a line in between us. It's absolutely clear that you need information from various groups, from citizens, as well as, why not, from big companies who want to get their point across. But first of all, it has to be transparent. And second, I think there should never be money involved. So for me personally, I do not accept any present that goes beyond 10 euros. So what I actually did is I just brought the bottle back to where it was sent to. And it was also a tricky thing involved. It was the bottle not directly from the tobacco industry, even though they paid for it, but by a formal citizen group based in Vienna who would send all these bottles to all the MEPs. That is not the way how it should be done.
You say personal embracement. Does that mean that lobby interest groups know exactly what your personal taste is?
As far as wine is concerned, I doubt it.
Or whatever, whether it's concert tickets.
In general, you know, they do keep a track record on us. When I did the research, I wrote the first critical report within the Parliament in the year 2003. And there I was visiting quite a few lobbyists by then, and they could tell me even then, more than 10 years ago, exactly what each MEP in relevant committees had spoken about. They knew much better about what was going on within our committees than most MEPs did.
Mm-hmm. Pascoe, let's get you in here. Now, your organization keeps a critical eye on all of the lobby groups in Brussels. Issues like the NSA, energy, environment, these have all been key issues in the run-up to the elections. Which lobby groups, though, have been most active ahead of the elections coming up in May?
I think the elections provide a huge opportunity for all lobby groups, but I think what we have to be clear about is distinguishing what is a lobbyist. I mean, I work for Lobby Watchdog, but yet I am a lobbyist. I am in the Transparency Register, which all lobbyists should be in. Correct. Unfortunately, many are not in. However, there's a big difference between lobbyists who represent the public interest, such as myself, who represent the environment and other public interests, and those who represent private commercial interests, such as, for example, the European Smoking Tobacco Association. Because let's be honest, the tobacco industry does not share the same interests as the public, let alone the public health. I mean, what's good for the tobacco industry is inherently bad for our public health. If we smoke more cigarettes, we will have more lung cancer and lung disease. So let's be clear. And this is something that the World Health Organization was very, very clear about when they passed a piece of legislation that banned, as much as possible, all contact between tobacco lobbyists and public health officials, because ultimately they rightly accepted that the interests of the tobacco industry are inherently in conflict with the public health interest, and therefore all lobbying should be extremely limited, and any lobbying that does take place should be fully disclosed. So hearing what Hans has been saying about bottles of wine, I've also heard stories about huge kilogram packets of tobacco being sent to all MEPs, packets of e-cigarettes being sent to MEPs. These are all things which are frankly not really acceptable and not in the interest of the public. So
well, that's exactly what we want to get to, is what benefit or not benefit is brought to the consumer. And I want to hear from Peter on this. Do you agree that the tobacco lobbies do not represent the consumer?
Well, I think first I want to reply to your first question again about how are we regulated in our context with the officials of the EU institutions. And I think that Pascoe is actually misrepresenting there a bit what is the idea behind the World Health Organization's point of view. The World Health Organization very clearly defines any relationship between the tobacco industry and health officials as one where the health official needs to take lots of care in understanding that the interest of the tobacco industry is often diametrally opposed to the interest of the health policy or health official. In that sense, that is entirely clear. And I think we, in our context with the European Commission, for which this particularly applies, of course, always make sure that we state our objectives very clearly, that anything we present is on paper, and that, of course, the official is totally at liberty to either meet with us or not. For politicians like Dr. Martin or Hans-Peter, that is exactly the same.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to flag that, unfortunately, despite the European Commission being one of the signatories, there's more than 80 countries who have signed this WHO declaration called Article 5.3. Despite the Commission being a signatory, and the European Commission is the originator of all legislation in the EU, despite it signing up, it simply hasn't enforced this. I mean, we've written complaints about the close relationship between the tobacco industry and some of its officials, and yet all it says is these are guidelines. So I'm quite disappointed that the European Commission has not taken the sort of position that a lot of public health watchdogs, a lot of scientists, a lot of doctors themselves would really like to see and make sure there's that, like Peter was saying, that red line, sorry, Hans was saying, that red line between the tobacco industry and public health officials. So, I mean, and let's be clear, you know, tobacco is the industry that created lobbying. I mean, it created, how can we undermine lobbying? And it's been...
Let's get back to what the aim of the whole thing is in the first place, and that's lawmaking, right? So, Hans-Peter, perhaps you could give us an example of a law that was made that was influenced by lobbyists that had a negative impact on the consumer.
Well, as I've said, since I'm in the Economic Committee, we mainly focus now on banking regulation. And what's happening there, whenever we come with a new regulatory step, most of the time we hear from the lobbyists out of the financial industry that is really big. There are estimates that they spend more than 300 million. They have a budget of more than 300 million euros per year, and there are at least 700 of them running around, that they already know what is coming, what will be put on our table as lawmakers out of the Commission before we know. And the very moment when then the proposal from the Commission is there, we get zillions of letters and very, very clear statements how to amend the proposals according to the interests of the lobbyists.
An example of one law that you're familiar with that hasn't been impacted in a negative way by lobbyists?
Just recently, when we had the question about splitting up banks, which is now on the table, where dividing investment banks and the private banks, that is the process that's going on right now, and the outcome we will see that will be then postponed to the next legislative period. But in general, it's always about lengthening time, reducing a regulation that would have any regulatory stronger impact on banks. It's always the same setup and the same format that they're acting on.
Now, Pascoe, you mentioned earlier that when we talk about lobbyists, we're not only talking about corporate interests, but also NGOs, also even people like yourself who are representing the consumer. Perhaps you could give an example of a law that was passed in such a way due to those interest groups that were having influence that was actually beneficial to the consumer.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be clear that laws are normally passed to protect consumers, to make sure that that we are, you know, be it the environment, be it social rights, be it the economy, that we make sure that it's working in the interest of the public. You know, politicians are elected to represent the public. We create institutions to represent the public interest. And so these laws are supposed to, by default, be in our interest. But then what happens is the big battle between certain, let's say, big business interests who are trying to make sure this law, I think what we have to understand is many laws, such as high environmental standards, might mean bigger costs for big polluting companies, such as factories, who might be putting out toxic fumes into the air. So if we want higher air pollution standards, you know, we begin a regulatory process and we're heading in that direction, and then you have the huge, intense big business lobbying that comes in. And I think the question is, how can consumer groups and others really fight back? And there have been examples where we've managed to fight back, but it doesn't just take what goes on in Brussels. It takes people in the streets across Europe. I mean, you have to have public outcry. So a recent example was around internet privacy. ACTA is the, I can't remember the acronym, it's the Act for Copyright and Trademark. It's to do with basically copyright around the internet and internet privacy. And it was going through the European Union and the European institutions, and actually people came out on the streets across Europe to make sure this didn't happen. So I think whilst here in Brussels, what we're really good at is providing information and really trying to explain what happens. It has to be people at national level in our capitals putting pressure at national level to make sure things go well here in Brussels.
Well, and some of those voters, some of those consumers are also our DW Facebook users. We asked them whether lobbyists should be allowed in the first place to influence EU lawmakers. A majority of them said no. However, lobbyism is an established part of a democratic system. Peter, perhaps you can tell us why lobbyism is so important to a functioning democracy.
Well, from my perspective, and I've done this now for 15 years for various industries, as well as for interest groups actually, it is just a very simple fact that a politician, as well as officials, are not omnipresent and do not know everything. So they need to obtain certain information and expertise about an industry or about an issue where they perhaps know not enough about. And that's where the interaction comes between the lobbyists on the one hand, representing their interests, as well as the politicians and other interest groups who have perhaps another view or another interest in the same legislative development. That whole interaction, and I totally agree with the other two gentlemen, is absolutely critical for the politician, but also needs to be very transparent and very clear who is doing what. And that transparency works for everyone the same, for industry representatives or
the key words, because a register, and I believe that came up earlier in our web talk, for lobbyists in Brussels was recently introduced in order to improve that transparency. However, the register is voluntary, so that means we don't actually know how many people are actively influencing the MEPs in Brussels. Pascoe, do you think making that register mandatory is the best way to keep lobbyists accountable to consumers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a first step. Having a mandatory register means we as citizens, I mean, I think we have to be clear, we are more than consumers. You know, we also it's not just what we buy, but we enjoy our environments, we enjoy our health services and our transport systems. So making sure that we see who's trying to influence our politicians and our policymakers is incredibly important. And then we get to see how many meetings. I mean, because having this register, unfortunately, we have an untransparent register, a voluntary register, and the ironic thing is unfortunately the punishment for not following the rules of the register, because let's be clear, in the transparency register there is a code of conduct for how lobbyists should behave, and I'm sure Peter knows the code very well and tries to adhere to it. But if those lobbyists who don't, the punishment is then you are removed from the register. And so if we have a register that doesn't work anyway, it's never going to work.
Whether the European Smoking Tobacco Association is on the register.
Well, we are. Of course we are, and like Pascoe said, we know what the code implies and what the code actually states. And I think it's only good that there are rules like this. I actually know that in Brussels, my colleagues from either companies or from other parts of the tobacco industry are all registered in the register as well. And making it very clear, I represent not only big business, I also represent 50 small, medium-sized enterprises who also need to be heard in the process, and therefore they elect lobbyists in Brussels who represent their views. So I think this whole balancing game between making very clear who does what and who says what, and listing actually the amount of meetings, and making very clear what the rules are, is only to be applauded by professional lobbyists who know that that is the only way this system will work in the future as well.
Hans-Peter, do you think that your constituents would actually read a register if it meant more transparency for lobbyism in Brussels?
Could be, but that's not necessary. Again, these have been very nice words, I have to say. In reality, first of all, not only the register is not mandatory yet, but what we need would actually be an actual account of who is doing what, who is contacting whom, when, on what matter. And that has been a strong desire from active MEPs like me over the years, and who is blocking it? The lobbyists themselves. It's also not true that the majority is registered. It has become a very common practice these days that big law firms represent special interests within the lobbying community and don't even disclose who they actually work for. This is all still very legal. So what I am asking for is a serious footprint of any kind of legislation, so that even a commission official who brings forward the first proposal would have to disclose his personal contacts. Mr. Michel Barnier has gone a certain way in this direction in answering personal letters from my side in the regulation that I've just mentioned before, but he's the first and the only one just in the early beginning stages what has to be done, which I think is even more important, that as in the legislation itself, in the legislative process, us MEPs have to disclose on every amendment where we got the idea from, and it can be a trade union, it can be Greenpeace, it can be CEO, it can be a big lobbyist, but then the general public would know much better on what basis we actually form legislation. And last point, when you say, well, the MEPs cannot know everything, for sure we cannot. But what we should have much more is independent research. It's ridiculous. We have a budget in the EU Parliament of 1.4 billion a year, and only a very small part is spent on technical services, very much in contrast to the US and other countries. If we would have more independent researchers assisting our work, we would indeed become more independent in the voter sense. And also we would need a balance. It cannot only be, look at how expensive it is to rent office space in Brussels. At least we should have a house just dedicated to NGOs where they could then also have their offices there and make their case heard. It's so completely uneven. You have the big companies with a lot of money and then the massive NGOs with basically zero funding.
So to wrap up today's web talk, let's take a look back at the title that we started off with, right? Lobbyists in the EU, the puppet masters, ? So give me each of your opinions, but with a yes or a no. Are lobbyists in the EU indeed puppet masters? Peter, let's start with you.
No, I don't think we are puppet masters, and we should definitely not be. Every commission official, every politician, whether in the European Parliament or anywhere else, need to make up their own mind based on the information they are getting fed by industry, NGOs, or anyone. That's their job. That's why they were elected.
Okay, Hans-Peter?
It depends on the individual stature. If you are not a very active MEP, if you don't understand what the problem is all about, you're very often directed by the lobbyists. They do the work for you, and it's so comfortable, and that's why we need full transparency.
And what about you, Pascoe?
Well, I think that depends on what rules we have in place, which is why it's so important with this election coming up that incoming MEPs really take a tough stance on transparency. So we're launching a campaign on Tuesday called Politics for People, Not Profit. If you go to www.politicsforpeople.not-profit, we're asking all incoming MEPs and candidates to sign our pledge to stand up for democracy and citizens and for transparency. So check it out. Hopefully you'll be able to give the link.
Okay, thank you very much to Peter, Hans-Peter, and Pascoe for your interesting insights in this web talk, and thank you for tuning in to this DW web talk. If you'd like to add your thoughts to the discussion or get in touch, then head to our DW Facebook page or send us a tweet to our accounts DW_Europe or DW_Politik. Don't forget the hashtag DW web talk. Thanks again, and goodbye from Bonn.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.